Hi, this is Joel Rosenberg. I'm the founder and editor-in-chief of All Israel News. Shalom from Jerusalem. Very honored to be joined today and to have an opportunity to interview one of the members, one of the candidates for the Knesset and a strategist within the Yamina party of Naftali Bennett. His name is Jeremy Saltan. And Jeremy, welcome to All Israel News.
Thank you. It's a pleasure, Joel.
Thank you very much. It's great to be with you. Now, we're just days away here from yet another round. We joke that Israel is the only real democracy in the Middle East, but we must really love elections a lot. We have 4 rounds
Too much
in 2 years. There's a couple things. I want to start on a policy note with Bennett's economic plan, which I find very, very interesting. And then obviously I want to ask you some political football questions, as it were, and some of the polling and kind of where are we, since this is an expertise of yours. And by the way, for those of us who are joining All Israel News on this interview, Jeremy has the only site that I'm aware of, and he won't tell me if there's another one probably, that he's got a blog that tracks all of the polling, public polling that's going on at any given moment. He's a few days behind, because he's pretty busy as a candidate in the final days of this election. But it's a very helpful site, KnessetJeremy.com, I believe.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So I commend that to you. Okay. So you are, first of all, an American dual U.S. Israeli citizen. You are the one that's been heading up the effort to reach out to Anglo voters, English-speaking voters, here in Israel for many years for Bennett and his team. And so you really understand this world. And let's talk about, I would say that, is it fair to say that Bennett's economic reform and pro-growth plan is the signature policy agenda that he's laid out in this campaign?
Yeah, I think for sure, if you're looking at all of the plans, and one of the things I'm very proud about our party is that we've put out more plans than anybody. There are a lot of parties that put out platforms, which pretty much says, I declare to do X, but they're not going to explain to you how they're going to do it. They're not explaining to you how they're going to pay for it, but they'll tell you what it is that they believe in. The Singapore plan, which is our economic plan, is definitely the signature plan of this campaign. We have a bunch of other plans. We have a housing plan. We, of course, have a Corona plan. We have an education plan. We have, an environment plan. We just went ahead and put pen to paper and said how we plan on actually doing all of the things that we believe in. And that really puts us very much apart from the rest of the parties in this race.
So we should have gone through all of those, but for the sake of time today, the one that certainly caught my attention it was certainly with the coronavirus. That was the first plan as defense minister that Bennett laid out, and which Netanyahu seems to have not responded to much at all at the time. So that obviously is a big source of criticism by Bennett and the Yamina party at Netanyahu. But on the economic plan, one of the things I saw an interview with Bennett the other day in English, and he was saying, look, when Benjamin Netanyahu was the finance minister in 2003, he was quite bold with making economic reform plans, using an opportunity in a crisis to lay something out, and hasn't really done that since. Now, I hear in the last couple of days talk of some tax cuts, maybe Bennett's having some effect there. Why don't you just lay out the major principles and key parts of the Singapore plan, and why do you call it the Singapore plan?
Well, we'll start with why we call it the Singapore plan. About 20 years ago, Israel and Singapore had very similar metrics in terms of their economies. They had about the same GDP. We're looking at a situation where, for the most part, the taxes were around the same. The amount of government spending on defense, which is, of course, something that is unique, I would say, to this part of the globe. Sorry, do you hear in the background the noise?
It's okay. A very family-friendly campaign from Jeremy Saltan.
It's fine. I can put in the headphones if you want.
It's okay. As long as it's back you.
I apologize.
The age of Corona. We get it.
It is indeed. The situation that we have is that Singapore decided to make a change at that point. They decided to drastically cut taxes. They decided to go ahead and go to an economy that deals more with the private sector. And what we saw was that they were able to, from the point where we were about the same, just completely double, triple, and quadruple, where they were, as opposed to Israel that is more or less, it's gone up, but if you're looking at the rate of growth, it's been very slow, and we've not seen the increase that you would see in Singapore, or that you do see in a majority of the Western economies, if you're looking at the US or Canada or Germany or UK and so on and so forth. So what we want to do is bring that to Israel. How do we do that? So right now the corporate tax is very high. It's 23%, one of the highest around the globe. We're going to lower that to 15%. That's, of course, going to be able to create the conditions that are necessary for a lot of foreign investors to want to go ahead and invest within the Israeli economy. Besides that, it's great to go ahead and try to help the businesses. You want to be able also help people who are working. The way the Israeli economy has always, conducted itself is a situation where they'll give a lot of welfare payments, or there'll be, stimulus checks where everybody gets, as opposed to going ahead and favoring the person who's actually contributing to the economy and working and being productive. So what our plan does is it takes the income tax, depending on where your bracket is, we're going to reduce it between 15 to 20%. I know that sounds like a lot, but yeah, we're going to reduce the income tax, depending on your bracket, between 15 to 20%, put more money in each person's pocket. Of course, that is going to help them in the short term in terms of dealing with the financial impact that, of course, Corona has had on all of us, but also goes ahead and it increases, of course, consumer spending and confidence within the economy. And of course, it helps a lot of the small businesses who are now able to hire a lot more people because of the reduction in the corporate tax. Now, you have to pay for it, right? It's great to go ahead and come up with these grand plans. But you have to know how it is that you're going to be able to balance your revenue and expenses in a way where you're actually going to be able to see growth. So
yes, especially since Israel is running such a huge deficit right now.
Yeah, I mean, for sure, a majority of countries are at this point, given the financial impact, once again, of Corona. But we are in a situation where we do see a way to be able to deal with this issue. Now, the public sector is very, very big in Israel. It comes from the socialist roots that started from the foundation of the state. Now, the only way to go ahead and do what we feel is necessary to create 400,000 new jobs is to see that through the private sector. Because asking the public sector to pay for it, right? We're talking about the government deficit here, when we already don't really have the money to do so, right, is not necessarily the smartest way to go about it, even if you're not a free market, capitalist such as myself. So we really don't necessarily have the money to spend in order to even go ahead and give more people more money from the government and further devalue our currency. What we can do is freeze the spending that's going on in the public sector. We're not looking to go ahead and fire anybody, but there is a lot of fat there. And there are a lot of people who retire every year. There are a lot of people who might go on maternity leave or disability. We don't need to replace those jobs. We can go ahead and, with some very, very simple moves, be able to just freeze the spending in a way where, even if we're looking at the natural growth, which you have in every fiscal year, since salaries will go up in the public sector by X%, depending on where you're at. There are various, labor deals that have been put in place, 20 years back that you can't touch. But what you can do, as I said, is figure out ways to freeze the spending. Another way to do it, for instance, in America, you have the IRS, right? Here, you have 3 different companies that go ahead and you collect your taxes and deal with collecting the revenue. You have Social Security, you have income tax, and then you have the VAT, the value added tax. 3 completely different departments with 3 different CEOs and boards of directors, and a lot of people are making a lot of money, and they're all taking the same money from the same people. This can be done through one area. Another thing that is always usually talked about when it comes to Israel is the crazy amount of ministers that we have in this country.
Wow.
However, one of the things—
we have 36 cabinet ministers at the moment?
It's I don't remember if it's 34, 36,
34,
but yeah, it's a crazy amount. Of course, more than the United States, which population-wise, of course, you're looking at hundreds of millions compared to about 10 million here in Israel. But I'm saying the ministers are only one of the issues there. One of the bigger issues is the ministries. There are people with all of those ministers that we mentioned where they're a minister of more than one ministry. Okay, we have about 40 something government ministries at this point. It is just, again, too much fat. You can go ahead and trim a lot of that stuff down. And again, that's less money for director generals and their staffs and so on and so forth. So people who are in the civil service who are that's fine. But and we saw this also in the Trump administration. There are a lot of slots that are political appointments. You can get rid of them, and you will be able to save really billions.
What kind of traction do you all see on the ground with this plan?
Well, of course, the main thing whenever you come up with a plan is the opposition of the plan. That's always what you see. You have the big labor unions who are very much against the plan. You have a lot of the socialist, newspapers running, op-eds against us and how dangerous it is and how bad Western economy and capitalism are and how we should avoid going in that direction and so on and so forth. So obviously, the most vocal are going to be people who are against your plan because they've read it, they understand it. In their eyes, they're seeing the danger of what happens to them and the old system if we make these changes. And they're trying to do everything within their power to be able to stop us. But I'll tell you, when I'm going ahead and I'm speaking about the plan just as I'm speaking with you, and I'm doing that in front of groups. Yesterday we were in State Road, but now we're able to do, what we call person-to-person campaign events now, not just in the Zoom events. But even before when we launched and we're still doing the Zoom events, people are very excited about the plan because they're saying, we understand that this is not exactly a point within, Israeli history when we're dealing with a very tough deficit and so on and so forth, that we can go ahead and expect a crazy amount from the government. But we do understand that instead of maybe seeing our wages increase, if the government takes less from us, don't raise my salary, but cut my taxes, allow me to have more money in my pocket so I can get through the short term that I need to, that's something.
So apologize for that little glitch, but okay. So I'm very intrigued, and I think many people are, because we haven't really seen economic plans, detailed pro-growth plans from multiple parties, including from the prime minister. Though I noticed in his interview with the Jerusalem Post on the Tel Aviv International Salon, he did refer to tax cuts. We haven't, to my knowledge, I'm not sure if I've seen anything that's specified or detailed. But this is something that I think is noteworthy that Naftali Bennett and your team at Yamina is doing. Now, let's talk politics because we are just days away from this thing. Okay.
Yes.
Now, Bennett would probably be running around 20 seats right now if Gideon Sa'ar had not left Likud and started New Hope. I mean, and so what you two have done, or your two teams, Yamina and New Hope, have done is basically split the center-right vote that is, well, I guess Gideon is certainly going with the center-right vote that has had it with Netanyahu, and Naftali Bennett and you and Yamina are going with those who may say, I'm not sure I'm happy with everything that I'm seeing from the prime minister, but we might work with him or we might not. I mean, this is one of the things. So I want to just get your first view on the politics of splitting that center-right vote, because together you guys would have had quite, you've probably been the second largest faction, or neck and neck with Lapid. So where does that place you as we go into these final days?
Yeah, I mean, we were in the polls. We were over 20 seats in the polls before Gideon Sa'ar's party came out. He for sure took some of our support. But if you're looking at the last polls, and of course the final polls come out Friday, after that there's a black hole where you're not allowed. I mean, I get to, you mentioned, in terms of polling, so I'm I'm one of the big names here. I get to see the polling. Other people cannot. You cannot publicize beyond Friday.
Right.
But Gideon Sar, in a majority of the polls, he's already fallen down to single digits. If you are looking at the polls, all the polls that have come out from the last already 2 weeks or so have us in third place solidly. We're one of only 3 parties, again, who've been in double digits consistently. All the others are sort of flustering around within single digits. The Israeli political map can be looked upon 2 ways. One is to look at it right-left. Another one is to look at it as for or anti-Bibi. In terms of the right, so at this point, depending on whatever poll you're looking at, you're looking, for the most part, between 80 to 90 seats in terms of parties that consider themselves to the right of center. Mm-hmm. And when you're looking at the parties that are to the left of center, and you exclude the Israeli Arab parties who have historic tendency to just
not
shy away.
For our viewers and readers, not because they're Arab, but because they're Muslim Brotherhood, or they are communist, or they are anti-Zionist.
Correct.
They're citizens of the state, and they have every right to have anything they want. But most of the the Zionist parties, which is the vast majority, don't historically team up with those parties that are not.
Yeah, but I would say also, I mean, even when Benny Gantz and the last government wanted to team up with the joint list of their parties, they were not interested in joining up with him. Because as you pointed out, you might imagine that the Muslim Brotherhood is not looking to hook up with the Zionist party.
Well, they're flirting with Bibi now. I mean, so it's hard to imagine. But anyway, let's stay focused.
But yeah, that is an interesting thing. But again, in terms of the blocks, so you have a situation where, again, the great majority, whether it's 2/3 or 3/4, there's no question here in which the next government will not have a right-wing majority. The numbers just don't add up. That's just the reality of it.
Right.
And even though Yair Lapid is running at the head of the anti-Bibi bloc, and that's the second way to look at things, he just doesn't have a pathway to 61. So the second way of looking at things is people who are for Bibi or against Bibi. We have one group of parties led by Bibi, and that has also the Haredi parties and a few others. They will only sit with Benjamin Netanyahu. They won't sit with anybody else, if you believe them, of course. Then you have they're politicians after all. Then you have another group of people under Yair Lapid who say they will sit with anybody but Bibi. As long as their name is something other than Netanyahu, they're happy to sit with them.
Right.
And you have a bunch of groups in there, and that's Yesh Atid, and that includes right-wing parties such as Gideon Sar, Avigdor Lieberman of Yisrael Beitenu, and then other parties, again, left of center, such as Blue and White, Labor, Meretz, and so on and so forth. And then you have our party, which is in the middle, when it comes to that scenario, not when it comes to the right and left.
Nobody calls you guys. I mean, Yamina, for those who don't speak Hebrew, Yamina literally means rightward.
Exactly.
So they're not centrist, but in the anti-Bibi, pro-Bibi split, your boss, the head of the party, Naftali Bennett, has said he's not going to make it. He's not going to vow to be one way or the other, but he has certain principles that he wants to see. But he has been pretty strong in his language about it's time to remove Netanyahu. In fact,
yes.
I will just note that Bennett is running as, yes, a former special forces commander in one of the most elite forces in Israel, in the army, but also as a CEO, as an entrepreneur, sold his company for $145 million, that he is a guy who knows business. And the plan that you're describing certainly speaks to that. And Bennett is using the language, it's time to fire the CEO. Yes. That means fire Netanyahu. So while he hasn't vowed not to serve with him, he's certainly making the strongest case that I've ever heard him make. So where does that leave you guys?
Well, until now, we've always recommended Netanyahu to be the prime minister of Israel. I know sometimes people forget this, but as I said, we're third in the polls, and we are running to be prime minister. Naftali is out there saying that he wants to be the next prime minister of Israel. He does want to fire the CEO You mentioned, his best victory. I mean, he sold four companies, right? He did 4 exits. The guy is well off. I can tell you, his living room is quite spacious. He's a person who doesn't need any of this. All right. He's here because he really cares. As you said, a person who's a veteran of the idea of special forces and a commander. He just feels that we need to have actual leadership of people who have actually done things outside of politics. And it's not that Netanyahu was terrible for a bunch of years and, that we hate him or whatever else. Again, we were there around the table with him. But over the last 10, 11 months, we've had what we feel is the most disastrous of a government that we've ever seen. And unfortunately, when a lot of things that might seem common sense, right, we're one of the only countries that did not require testing, corona testing before going into the country, even at the part where we already knew that there was a British mutation, a South African mutation, we just didn't require testing. These are just things of negligence. It's not budget.
There's no budget in this country.
There is no budget, but you saw what happened. We didn't pass a budget because also Netanyahu wouldn't agree to give over, the mandate to Gantz to be the next prime minister, which was a signed agreement that he made. Look, over the last year, we've seen that Netanyahu has been around a little bit too long. Again, he's done great things for the state of Israel, and I think for the globe, and I really mean that. He's done a lot for Western civilization. But the truth is he's already been prime minister for over 15 years. This term is 12 years consecutively. And I'm just asking people, does it make sense that the same guy should be in power longer than FDR? Like, there's a reason why in a democracy you have term limits.
Let me ask you one last question, because and this is a fascinating conversation, and we're going to know some results in the next few days. And then the whole process begins, which, again, American and some others who are not in a parliamentary system find it fascinating, challenging. It's hard to imagine because, and I just want to let our readers and viewers know, there is a pathway for Naftali Bennett to actually emerge as the prime minister. It would be, to go back in history, it's almost like Abraham Lincoln becoming president in 1960. He won the Republican nomination because every other major candidate were fighting and sniping at each other. And Abraham Lincoln was the sort of consensus candidate. He was everybody's number 2 choice. So there is a scenario that even with only 11, 12, 13, 14, whatever seats that come out, and often right-wing parties here are underpolled. People come in last minute and decide. So we may see some breaking numbers. That would be true, I think, of Likud also. They're almost entirely getting numbers that are higher on election day than on the last few polls. But that being said, if Netanyahu can't put together a government, and that would involve Bennett saying no, I mean, he would have to proactively say no. Then the question would be, if Bibi can't do it, then who becomes the person around which everybody coalesces for the sake of not going to a 5th, God forbid, election? But then there has to be a consensus. And there's 3 main people that could be that person. Yair Lapid is leading the faction, as you say, of Yesh Atid, the centrist party that is at about 20. So if he comes in 18 to 22, he might very well probably be the second biggest faction. So normally the second biggest faction, would get the nod. However, very few on the center right they might let him be part of their government, but they're not likely, anything's possible. You mentioned the word politicians. But Lapid is not likely to be able to pull that together. So then the question is, if that were to happen, then you are left with Gideon Sa'ar, who was at one point number 2 in the Likud party and very close to Bibi, but has had his falling out. But he has slipped back. New Hope has slipped behind Naftali Bennett and Yamina. So Bennett could have an option if everybody coalesces, even if he only had a dozen or 15 or whatever seats. So that is an interesting formula. I guess my question to you, and then there's one other point, and that is, then I'm going to put this question to you and we can close on your thoughts on this. But you mentioned there's left and right. That's the normal way to look at to slice an election.
Right.
This is the pro-Bibi, anti-Bibi way to look at it. And I think that is probably the most accurate. But within that, there's also, I think, people who have worked for Bibi very closely and are not convinced. They're either they become anti or I think we need a change. And I would note there's a large group of leaders in Israel now who were like Naftali Bennett was a chief of staff for Bibi Netanyahu.
Yes.
Avigdor Lieberman, chief of staff for Bibi Netanyahu. Gideon Sa'ar, the number 2 in Likud and a trusted deputy. Yair Lapid was the finance minister for Bibi Netanyahu. Benny Gantz was a defense minister. And these people will say now they will never serve except your guys. So that leads me to this sort of central question, and that is this. I'm burying the lead because this would be the most interesting part, but I think that policy is important for people to hear. Yeah. But here's the question, Jeremy. Bibi Netanyahu is going to get the first nod, almost certainly, to put together a government. He will come in at probably 30 to 35 seats. That'll be the largest faction, right, coming into the Knesset. So at that point, does Naftali Bennett say, yes, I'm with you? Or at that point, does he decide, no, we really do need a new CEO? And that's not about being anti-Bibi, but it's
right.
If you know, but he really has to make a decision prior to Bibi failing, because he is the reason that Bibi Netanyahu will not be able to put together a government, right? He is the kingmaker by all media declarations.
Correct.
Okay, there you go. There's the setup. You know,
he's always looked at the kingmaker. I love the 1860 reference, and not just because I'm from Chicago, and of course Lincoln is our guy from Illinois.
See, you're a dual U.S. Israeli citizen like me. That we get to vote twice. It's like living in Chicago.
Indeed.
Okay, I'll let you.
You know, indeed, in Chicago, we always say that you vote early and you vote often. So maybe twice, but maybe 3 times also. It depends how close you are with the alderman in charge. But I'll tell you that what we saw in 1860, besides the fascinating primary victory that Lincoln had, you had the general election with 4 candidates who all won states, and Lincoln won without even getting 40% of the national vote. Mm-hmm. With 30-something percent, he became president, and of course he's known now as one of the. But besides Washington, I don't think there's any president that stands up. He was able to preserve the Union and have his place in history. The way the Israeli system works, we have a 3-phase process. The first part is we said, is the Knesset election, where we vote for our Congress. The second part is when the people need to make recommendations in the president's residence, where all the parties that entered need to choose who is their candidate for prime minister. And then the third step is that you need to have a motion of confidence, because unlike America, where you can have the president with a Congress that's not with him, you have to make sure that the government comes out of the Knesset and that the executive and legislative branches work together. Mm-hmm. Now, the way that I see it, because I'll tell you, Naftali said, and we're going to stand behind that, we're not going to recommend Netanyahu. So when we get to the president's residence, Netanyahu is not going to have 61. Most likely, as you said, he'll have the most recommendations. Lapid will probably have the second most recommendations. It's possible that we will. It depends, of course, this race between us and Lapid. And there are a lot of undecided voters out there, about 15 seats worth. There's enough to put us above him. And of course, that would change the entire dynamic of how this entire thing would go. But assuming that the polls are correct the way that they are today, and Lapid is in second place, and then we're in third place when it comes to the nominations, what would happen is Bibi would make that call, as you said, and ask Naftali, will you come down and have a conversation with me? Even though you didn't nominate me, will you talk to me about possibly voting in the Knesset in confidence of my government? I don't know if that's going to happen. I don't know if that's going to go. It's very possible that he doesn't agree after taking that call. I don't think he would, screen or ghost the prime minister. I think he would take the call. I don't know if he would commit to sitting with him. I can tell you that afterwards, whether he sat with him or not, the fact of them being able to get to some sort of deal is something that's very difficult. But I'll tell you also, if the second mandate goes to Lapid after Netanyahu fails, I find it even more difficult, because we have said flat out, and this is what we mean, we are not going to sit under a government that's led by Lapid. So I don't really understand what the benefit would be. But again, it's possible that Bennett sits. It's possible he doesn't sit. If he sits, is he able to come to any agreement? I'm not so sure. But as I said, 60 seconds ago, there are 3 tries to form a government before you give up and you go to a repeat election, a snap election. Now, in the past, there has been only 2 candidates. The first 3 elections, you only had 2 candidates for prime minister. Both failed. And then you would get to the third mandate, and they would both fight over who gets the signatures to be able to try the third time. Here, when you have 3 candidates, or if you want to say 4 candidates with Gidon, but again, Gidon is under us, so the chances of him being able to surge and get that third spot is less likely. When you have at least 3 candidates, and you have a candidate who's running third, if the first 2 fail, that's when the third one, sometimes, as we like to say in Hebrew, Shnaim Ravim Hashlishi Lokech, 2 people fight, the third one takes it. Lincoln was a good example, both in the primary of how he won the Republican nomination, then, between the split with Douglas, as well in the, general election with the Democrats, with the Northern and Southern Democrats. So here you could have a situation where, again, Bennett is able, in the third mandate, to be able to form a government. And the reason he's able to do that is, as I said, he is not in either camp of the only Bibi or the anyone but Bibi. And also, because a majority of the seats are on the right, he's in the right place where, if you're looking at the 2 axes of the Bibi, no Bibi, and the right left, Bennett is uniquely strategized himself into a spot where he can be that consensus, or as some people like to call compromise candidate, to be able to form the next government. And I would say that if you are looking at the current numbers, and I do expect them to change a little bit, but based on the current numbers, it's either Bennett is able to form a coalition, or we're going to go to a 5th election. That is where I see the race right now. I don't see a situation where the other 2 are going to be able to form anything here. So what ends up happening, it depends, what are the final polls going to be on Friday? What are the final election results? What are the nominations in the president's residence? But of course, if we're playing with the horse race here, more or less, it's very likely that is the position in terms of what we should expect moving forward.
Well, Jeremy, you're an astute observer, but you're also now a practitioner of Israeli politics. And just to finish up, I think you are 16th on the slate.
Yes.
So it's not actually unreasonable to think that as numbers close in the final days, you actually could become a member of Knesset if we have a Knesset. But this is a challenge because the stakes are very high. This is all very interesting, but people are suffering, and so it does seem dreadful to many of us to think of a 5th round, because it just seems like, come on, we need to get going. We need to get this country reopened and up on its feet. I don't like the brand of the startup nation being known as the shutdown nation, and I think we gotta find our way out of it. But we went much longer than I'd intended, and I apologize. But I appreciate the conversation. It's really quite interesting, and I think that most people outside the country, Netanyahu is the brand they know, and what we're trying to provide coverage, certain of what he's doing and saying, but also what could change. Naftali Bennett, Gidon Sar, Yair Lapid, these are names that every Israeli knows, but most people outside the country are not familiar. So if one of these emerges, people are like, who are these people? How did they get to be major players? And so we're trying to provide that coverage on All Israel News. So thank you for spending some time with us in a very busy, countdown to the Tuesday elections. Thank you, Jeremy Saltan.
Thank you, Joe. It was my pleasure to be with you.
Great. Thank you so much.